The cowboy thought he would die alone, until 3 virgin Apache women arrived at his cabin, Wild West. The wooden walls, darkened by years of sun and wind, creaked softly in the breeze. A small stone chimney puffed occasional wisps of smoke into the wide, empty sky, and around the cabin, the land stretched for miles with only low scrub brush, cactus, and jagged rocks as companions. John had chosen this life, he liked to tell himself, because the quiet suited him. The solitude gave him time to think, to remember, and to forget. John's days were long and predictable. He woke before the sun, usually to the sound of Shadow, his black stallion, nudging the door as if reminding him it was time to feed. He would fill the trough, feed the few chickens he kept, and then head out on horseback to check the small stretch of land he had claimed. Over the years, he had learned the secrets of the desert, which cacti held water where the best wild herbs grew, and which paths were safest to cross during sudden storms. He knew every bend in the dry creek bed, every low ridge where rattlesnakes might hide, and every rock that could shelter him from the wind. John's life had not always been so quiet. In his youth, he had been part of long cattle drives, riding across wide plains, sleeping under stars, and sharing stories with other cowboys around campfires. Those were wild, noisy years, full of laughter, danger, and adventure. But those days had passed. Some of his companions had died in accidents or in fights over land. Others had moved on to towns, families, or jobs that the open desert could not offer. John had loved once deeply, but that woman, Mary, had died giving birth to their only son, who had passed away in infancy. After that, the world had seemed emptier than ever, and he had retreated into the silence of the wilderness. Inside the cabin, there was little to remind anyone of a family life. The floor was rough, the furniture handmade and sturdy but simple. A wooden table with uneven legs held a few tin plates and a cast-iron pan, blackened from years of use. The bed, covered with a worn quilt, was against the far wall, next to a small window that looked out over the dusty land. A shelf held a few books, mostly old novels and survival manuals. John rarely read them. He preferred to sit outside, letting the desert teach him lessons in its own quiet way. Evenings were the hardest. As the sun sank behind the distant mesas, casting long shadows across the sand, John would light the fireplace and sit on the rough-hewn chair near it. Sometimes he would talk aloud to Shadow, recounting memories from decades past, or muttering to himself about the coming storms or the quality of the hay. The horse, as if understanding him, would listen quietly, occasionally flicking its tail or stamping a hoof. But beyond that, there was only silence. Sometimes, when the wind blew through the canyon, it carried strange sounds that made the hairs on the back of John's neck rise. Coyotes calling, rocks shifting, the wind whistling through narrow gaps, all reminders that the desert was alive, even if he was alone. John did not feel lonely every day. Some days, the work and the routine kept him busy. He enjoyed fixing fences, checking traps, and chopping firewood. He liked the rhythm of life that demanded effort but gave little reward beyond survival. But at night, especially in winter, he felt the weight of emptiness. The firelight would flicker on the walls, and he would look at the shadows and imagine the voices of people he would never see again. He would think about Mary, about his son, about the friends he had lost. It was a quiet pain, one that had become almost comfortable, like a familiar wound that no longer hurt as sharply but never fully healed. He thought about the town sometimes. There was a small settlement some 20 miles away, but he avoided it. Towns were full of noise, gossip, and people who asked questions he did not want to answer. They would have stared at him, the lonely cowboy living alone in the desert. He did not mind being stared at. He minded feeling exposed, feeling like his grief was on display. Here he was free. Here he was in control. The desert did not judge. The wind did not ask questions. The sun did not pity him. Despite his desire for isolation, John had a careful routine for survival. He checked his small trap lines daily, looking for rabbits or other small game. He had a cache of dried meat and cornmeal, enough to survive if a storm kept him in the cabin for days. He maintained his tools, sharpened his knives, and cleaned his rifle, though he seldom had to use it. He understood that life in the desert was unforgiving. A single mistake could lead to hunger, injury, or worse. Yet he also understood the beauty of it. The sunrise over the mesas painted the land in golden light. The stars at night were brighter than anything seen in towns, and the quiet, though sometimes heavy, brought him clarity. John had one secret wish, though he would never admit it aloud. He sometimes dreamed, in the deepest parts of the night, that he would find someone to share this life with, not out of desperation, but out of a quiet longing he could not explain. Someone who understood the rhythm of the land, who appreciated the silence, and who could smile at a small victory, like catching a rabbit or fixing a fence. But these dreams were fleeting. He would wake before dawn, hear the wind outside, and remind himself that dreams in the desert often stayed as dreams. That winter was particularly harsh. Snow dusted the mesas and collected in drifts near the cabin. The wind howled through the canyons, rattling the walls and making the fire fight harder to stay alive. John worked tirelessly to keep the cabin warm and stocked, cutting wood faster than usual, melting snow for water, and checking the horses' shelter. Even Shadow seemed more restless, sensing the cold and the long nights. John felt a twinge of loneliness sharper than before, imagining the cabin full of laughter, voices, or even quiet companionship. He shook his head and returned to chopping wood, telling himself he was not weak, only realistic. And yet that night, as he sat near the fire, staring into the dancing flames, John could not shake the feeling that something was about to change. He had no reason to expect anything. He was a man who had learned the desert kept its own secrets, and he trusted them, but a small, unexplainable hope stirred inside him. It was faint, like the first light of dawn on a cold morning, but it was there. And John, for the first time in many years, allowed himself to imagine that he might not be entirely alone after all. The quiet outside seemed almost alive. The wind shifted, and somewhere in the distance a faint sound reached his ears, a sound that did not belong to the wind or the animals. A voice, soft and trembling, carried across the snow. John froze, listening. Shadow stamped its hoof nervously. The sound came again, this time closer. Someone was out there, someone who needed help. John McAllister, the lonely cowboy, the man who thought he would spend his days in silence, did not know it yet. But his life was about to change forever. John had spent decades in the quiet of the Arizona desert, thinking he knew every sound, every gust of wind, every whisper of life across the barren land. That evening, the soft, unusual sound carried through the snowy silence had caught him off guard. At first, he thought it might be a wandering coyote or the wind shaking a distant tree. But as he strained his ears, he realized it was different, human voices. He grabbed his lantern and stepped outside, the snow crunching under his boots. The cold air bit at his cheeks and made his breath cloud in front of him. He scanned the horizon, the dim light from the cabin casting long shadows across the drifts of snow. Then he saw them, 3 figures moving slowly toward the cabin. They were hunched against the wind, shivering, their small feet barely leaving tracks in the snow. They were girls or young women, he couldn't tell from the distance. Something about them made his heart beat faster, not in fear but in recognition. These people were in trouble. John shouted, careful to sound calm but firm, "Hey, come here, it's safe." His voice cracked slightly in the cold air, but it carried. The figures paused, glancing around, unsure. Then they moved faster, almost running, until they reached the small porch of his cabin. Snow clung to their hair and clothes, and their faces were pale, lips chapped from the cold. Their eyes were wide with fear, darting nervously at the land that stretched endlessly behind them. John lowered the lantern and stepped closer. "You'll be safe here," he said. His voice was steady now, reassuring. "Come inside and warm up." The 3 women hesitated, glancing at each other. Finally, one of them, the tallest, stepped forward. We have nowhere else," she whispered. Her voice was soft, melodic, with an accent that John didn't recognize. The other 2 nodded silently, clutching their shawls tightly around their shoulders. Inside, the cabin smelled of smoke, wood, and the faint scent of herbs John kept in jars. He guided them to the fireplace, helping them remove their wet outer layers. The fire crackled, sending warmth into the room. John watched as the 3 women huddled close together, their bodies shaking slightly from the cold. He noticed their clothing, simple handmade garments, not like anything he had seen in town. He realized they were not settlers or travelers. They belonged to another way of life, one that lived close to the land and respected its harshness. "I'm John," he said, sitting across from them near the fire. "And this is Shadow," he added, nodding toward his horse, who watched silently from the corner of the cabin. "You'll be safe here tonight, I promise." The women exchanged glances again, unsure whether to trust him. Finally, the tallest one spoke again. "I am Ahuli," she said softly. "These are Nayeli and Kiona. We ran from danger. We had no choice." Her eyes were wide, frightened, but there was a quiet strength in her voice. John felt a strange mix of pity and respect. He had never been one to speak much about emotions, but he understood fear. He understood being alone and needing someone to help you survive. He gestured toward the table. "Sit. Eat. You must be starving." He fetched a loaf of bread he had baked earlier, some dried meat, and hot water to drink. The women hesitated for a moment, unfamiliar with his kind of food, but hunger overcame hesitation. They ate slowly, savoring each bite, and John watched them carefully. He noticed how they kept close to one another, protective, as if the world outside had taught them to trust only each other. As they ate, John asked gently, "Where are you from?" He did not push for details, only wanted to understand enough to help. Ahuli glanced at the other two before speaking. "We live with our people," she said, "in the mountains, but there were men, strangers. They wanted to hurt us. We ran. We didn't know where else to go." John nodded slowly. He had heard stories of conflicts in the region, of tribes being hunted or threatened by outsiders. The desert, though empty, was rarely truly safe. "You're safe here," he repeated. "No one will hurt you in this cabin, not while I am around." He spoke with quiet authority, the kind that came from years of surviving on his own. The women looked at him again, a flicker of relief in their eyes. After they had eaten, John brought blankets and showed them a corner of the cabin where they could sleep. The cabin was small, and there was barely enough room for all of them, but John didn't hesitate. They needed warmth and shelter more than he needed space. "We'll make do," he said, shrugging. "The fire will keep you warm tonight." That night, John sat near the door, listening to the wind outside. He heard soft breathing from the corner where the women slept, the occasional creak of wood settling. He realized he hadn't felt this sense of responsibility for anyone in years. It was strange, almost uncomfortable, but also comforting. The desert had taught him to rely on himself, to trust only his skills and instincts. Now he found himself watching over three people who had trusted him without knowing him. It was a new feeling, one he did not fully understand but felt deeply in his chest. In the morning, the women were awake before him, quietly tending to their hair and clothing. John prepared a small breakfast of porridge and dried fruit. He tried to make conversation, asking small questions about the land and their journey, learning bits about their customs and traditions. Ahuli, the tallest, spoke the most, while Nayeli and Kiona added small details. John listened with genuine interest. He had been alone so long that he had forgotten how much stories, even small ones, could brighten a morning. Days passed, and the women began to adjust to the rhythm of life in John's cabin. They helped gather firewood, fetched water from a nearby stream, and learned to cook simple meals over the fire. In return, they shared their own knowledge: how to find edible plants in the desert, how to read the signs of the weather, and how to move quietly across the land without being noticed. John realized that despite their youth, they were clever, resilient, and wise in ways he had never appreciated before. The bond between them grew slowly. There were no sudden declarations of trust or friendship. Instead, it was built on shared work, quiet conversations, and mutual care. John began to talk more than he had in years, sharing small stories of his past, teaching them how to shoot a rifle, and showing them which herbs could heal minor injuries. The women listened with patience and respect, sometimes teasing him gently when he grew too serious or stubborn. Evenings were no longer empty for John. The firelight now danced over three young faces, their eyes bright with curiosity and wonder. For the first time in decades, he felt the warmth of companionship that went beyond necessity. He realized that survival alone was not the only way to live. Sharing life, even in small ways, brought a new kind of strength. Yet John remained cautious. He had learned through years of solitude that trust had to be earned. He watched for signs of danger, for the possibility that the men the women had fled from might come searching. He knew the desert could be merciless, and while his cabin provided safety, it could not keep them safe from all threats. But for now, the three women were with him, alive and well, and that was enough. As the sun set behind the distant mesas, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, John stood outside with Shadow at his side, looking out across the snowy expanse. He thought about the strange turn of events that had brought the women to his doorstep. He had lived decades believing he would die alone, that the silence was all he would ever know. And yet, here they were, three young women who had stumbled into his life, and in doing so, had brought light into the quiet corners of his heart. John McAllister, the cowboy who had thought he would spend his life in solitude, now faced a new reality. Life could change in the blink of an eye, and sometimes, strangers could become the family you never expected. And deep in the quiet of the desert, he allowed himself a small, cautious hope that the days ahead, though uncertain, would not be as lonely as the years behind him. The days passed slowly at first, but gradually, life in John McAllister's cabin began to feel less like survival, and more like a new kind of living. The three women, Ahuli, Nayeli, and Kiona, had grown accustomed to the routine, though everything here was different from the mountains and plains they had known. They had to learn quickly how to handle chores like feeding the chickens, fetching water from the icy stream, chopping firewood, and cooking over an open flame. John watched carefully, offering guidance when needed, correcting gently when mistakes were made, and stepping back when he could. Ahuli, the eldest of the three, showed a natural curiosity and resilience that reminded John of the cowboys he had once ridden with. She asked questions about everything: how to keep the fire going in strong wind, how to mend a torn coat, how to recognize animal tracks in the snow. Nayeli was quiet but observant. She noticed details that John sometimes overlooked: the direction the wind was blowing, the subtle sounds of animals moving in the brush, and the smell of approaching weather. Kiona, the youngest, had a lightness about her. She laughed easily at small accidents, teased the others gently, and helped lift the mood when the long days felt lonely or tense. John, in turn, began teaching them skills he had honed over decades in the desert. He showed them how to track small animals, not to hunt recklessly, but to understand the land and its creatures. He taught them how to purify water, how to recognize signs of storms, and how to handle knives and tools safely. He explained how to ride a horse, at first slowly leading Shadow while the women clutched the saddle for balance, then allowing them to guide the horse over gentle slopes, learning the rhythm of the animal. The lessons were practical, but they also built trust. John could see that the women were intelligent and capable, and he began to admire their determination. At first, there were moments of tension. The women had grown up in a community that valued caution and survival, and their instincts often clashed with John's approach. They were hesitant to trust him completely, especially when he insisted on teaching skills that might seem dangerous, like crossing a narrow ridge or using a sharp knife. John was patient. He understood that trust could not be demanded, it had to be earned. He encouraged them gently, and slowly they began to relax, learning to follow his guidance while sharing their own knowledge in return. Ahuli taught John things he had never considered. She explained how her people could tell the approach of rain by the smell of the earth, how to find edible roots even in the cold of winter, and how to read the tracks of animals not just for hunting, but to understand their behavior. Nayeli taught him to notice subtle changes in the sky, the way the colors shifted before a storm, and how to prepare for sudden shifts in weather. Kiona taught him patience, reminding him to appreciate small joys like the warmth of sunlight after a snowstorm, or the beauty of a bird's call echoing through the canyon. Evenings became a time of quiet learning and sharing. The women would sit near the fire, sometimes telling stories of their lives before the flight from danger. Ahuli spoke of the mountains, the rivers, and the vast forests where her people had lived for generations. Nayeli recounted tales of village celebrations and family gatherings. Kiona shared the small adventures of a girl learning to weave, gather herbs, and explore the land. John listened with fascination, realizing how little he had known about the world beyond his own solitude. In return, John shared his own stories. He spoke of long cattle drives across wide plains, of nights spent under the stars with friends who were no longer alive, and of mistakes that had cost him dearly. The women listened quietly, their eyes reflecting empathy and curiosity. John realized that in sharing these memories, he was not only teaching them but also healing himself. He had carried years of loneliness and sorrow, but now he was learning that connection could ease those burdens. The cabin itself began to change. What had once been a place of mere survival became a home. The women brought small touches of their own. Kiona found colorful pieces of cloth to brighten the rough wooden benches. Ahuli arranged herbs near the windows to add scent and life, and Nayeli carefully cleaned and polished the fireplace, making it more welcoming. John noticed these changes with a mixture of pride and wonder. He had never thought of the cabin as more than shelter, but now it felt like a living space, alive with presence, care, and laughter. Life in the desert was not without challenges, and John made sure the women understood that. One afternoon, as they were collecting water from the stream, the wind picked up suddenly. Snowflakes swirled around them and the temperature dropped sharply. John instructed them to move quickly back to the cabin, teaching them how to conserve energy and stay warm, how to recognize frostbite, and how to manage limited supplies in emergencies. The women followed his guidance, moving with confidence, showing that they were learning not only survival skills but resilience. Yet even in these lessons, there were moments of joy. A small rabbit caught in a trap became a shared triumph. Shadows of birds overhead brought smiles. John taught the women how to make simple toys and games to pass time during long evenings, and they laughed together, the sound echoing through the cabin and out into the empty desert. It was a new kind of happiness, subtle but real, born from shared effort, care, and respect. The bond between John and the women deepened with each passing day. He began to think of them not just as guests or companions, but as a family of sorts. He noticed little details, the way Ahuli would arrange herbs near the fire, how Naeli would hum softly while cleaning, or how Kiona's laughter could lighten even the dreariest day. He realized that he had spent so long expecting to be alone that he had forgotten the quiet joy of being needed, of being trusted, and of being part of something larger than oneself. At night, when the wind howled outside and the fire flickered against the walls, John would sit and watch the women sleep. He felt a sense of calm he had not known in decades. For the first time, he believed that life could hold surprises, that even in the harshest desert, companionship could flourish. He understood that his life, which had seemed destined for solitude, was changing in ways he could not have predicted. And the women were changing too. They were learning the ways of the land beyond their mountains, gaining strength and independence, and learning to trust someone entirely different from their community. They began to laugh more freely, to explore the land with cautious curiosity, and to offer advice and guidance of their own. Each day brought small victories, small lessons, and small joys that bound them together in a quiet, enduring bond. John often reflected on the strange twist of fate that had brought them to his doorstep. He had thought his life was over, that the years of solitude had become permanent. And yet here were three young women, each brave in her own way, teaching him as much as he taught them, showing him that life could be richer than he had imagined. He realized that the desert, harsh as it was, had a way of connecting people when the moment was right. As winter began to ease, the snow melting into clear streams, John and the women ventured further from the cabin. They explored nearby ridges, learned which plants were edible, and even found small caves to shelter from sudden storms. Each adventure tested their trust, skill, and cooperation, and each success brought laughter and quiet pride. The women's confidence grew, and John felt a profound sense of satisfaction. He had not only protected them, but had helped them grow stronger, just as they had helped him grow in ways he had never imagined. By the time the first wildflowers began to peek through the thawing snow, the bond between John and the women was solid. They had become a unit, a family forged not by blood but by shared experience, trust, and care. The cabin was no longer just a shelter, it was a home full of warmth, stories, and laughter. And John, the cowboy who had believed he would live and die alone, finally understood something he had not allowed himself to hope for. Life could change, and it often did so in the most unexpected ways. Spring was arriving slowly in the Arizona desert. The snow had melted into small streams, the cacti were sprouting new green shoots, and the sun warmed the mesas in a golden light. Life at John McAllister's cabin had grown almost comfortable. The routines of gathering water, chopping wood, and caring for Shadow and the small flock of chickens were now shared tasks. Laughter and quiet conversation filled the cabin in ways John had never imagined possible. For the first time in years, the desert no longer seemed empty. It had become alive with companionship. But life in the Wild West was rarely without danger, and John knew it. The women had come to him for safety, but the threats they had fled from might still linger. One morning, while he was repairing a fence near the edge of his property, he noticed tracks in the soft earth. The prints were large, heavy, and human. They did not belong to any traveler or friend. John's chest tightened. He had been expecting peace, but the desert demanded vigilance, and now that the women were with him, he had to protect them more than ever. Returning to the cabin, John gathered the women around. "We need to be careful," he said quietly. "Someone may have followed you here." He studied their faces. Ahuli, always the calmest, nodded firmly. Naeli looked worried, but her eyes were sharp, alert. Kiona trembled slightly, clutching the blanket around her shoulders. John realized that fear was natural, but he also knew that panic could be deadly in the desert. "We will handle this together," he said. "Stay calm and listen to me. We can protect ourselves." Over the next few days, John prepared the cabin and the surrounding land for any potential visitors. He reinforced doors, checked the rifle and ammunition, and placed small traps along likely paths. The women helped, learning quickly how to move silently, hide, and remain alert. They practiced what to do if someone approached. John was patient, repeating instructions, teaching them to observe without being seen, to remain calm under pressure, and to think quickly in emergencies. It was not a lesson in violence, he reminded them, but in survival and self-protection. Then, one afternoon, a group of men appeared in the distance. John had noticed their shadows moving along the ridge, their shapes unmistakable. They were rough-looking cowboys, strangers, who did not belong to the land in the way John and the women did. The women froze, but John remained calm. He motioned for them to stay inside, whispering instructions on where to hide and how to remain silent. The men were curious, shouting questions and scanning the area. John kept his voice low, replying only when necessary and always showing confidence. Hours passed like this, tense and quiet. John and the women watched from behind the cabin's walls, listening to every footstep and voice. It was a test, not just of survival skills, but of trust and courage. The women had learned from John how to stay composed, and they applied their lessons perfectly. Ahuli peeked from behind a crate, observing the men's movements and signaling to John when a shift in position occurred. Naeli kept watch from the side, noting the direction of the sun and shadows. Kiona, though nervous, moved carefully, following John's instructions without hesitation. Finally, the men, unable to find any sign of life, gave up and moved on. The threat passed, but the tension remained. John exhaled slowly, feeling both relief and pride. "You all did well," he said. "Not one mistake. That is how we survive out here." The women relaxed gradually, the adrenaline leaving their bodies, replaced by a sense of accomplishment. They realized that they were stronger than they had thought, and that John's guidance was invaluable. After the danger had passed, John knew it was important to rebuild a sense of normalcy. He and the women returned to their routines, cooking meals, tending to Shadow and the chickens, and gathering wood. Yet even in these peaceful moments, there was a new understanding between them. Life could be harsh, unpredictable, and dangerous, but together they could face whatever the desert threw at them. The days turned into weeks, and the bond between John and the women grew deeper. They were no longer merely companions. They were a team, relying on each other for strength, safety, and comfort. The women learned the subtle rhythms of the desert, reading the clouds, the wind, and the tracks of animals. John, in turn, began to appreciate their wisdom and insight, recognizing that they brought a new perspective to life in the wilderness. They were cautious yet adventurous, blending their instincts with his experience. One afternoon, while exploring a nearby canyon, John and the women discovered a small cave. It was sheltered from the wind, dry and surprisingly warm. "This could be useful," John said. "A place to retreat if a storm comes or if we need to be hidden." Ahuli, Naeli, and Kiona nodded, their eyes wide with interest. They spent the rest of the day clearing out the cave, stacking firewood, and marking the entrance discreetly. John watched them work, amazed at how quickly they adapted to life in the desert. Their courage and resourcefulness impressed him more with each passing day. As the sun set over the mesas, the group returned to the cabin, tired but satisfied. The sky was painted in shades of orange and pink, a breathtaking reminder of the beauty that could be found even in the harshest landscapes. They sat around the fire, sharing a simple meal, laughing softly, and recounting the day's events. For the first time, John realized that life was no longer merely about survival. It was about connection, learning, and shared experience. Evenings became a time of reflection and bonding. John taught the women how to recognize stars, how to navigate by their patterns, and how to tell time by the sun and moon. In return, they shared their own knowledge. stories of their people, lessons about the land and its creatures, and ways to read subtle signs in the environment. Through these exchanges, John discovered a new appreciation for culture, wisdom, and the strength that came from generations of learning to live with the land. Yet, despite the growing comfort, John never let his guard down completely. The desert was beautiful, but it could also be unforgiving. There were still storms, predators, and the possibility of human threats. John reminded the women that vigilance was essential, teaching them to notice changes in weather, signs of approaching animals, and unusual tracks in the soil. The lessons were practical and necessary, but they also reinforced the bond of trust between them. The women learned to rely on John, and he learned to rely on them. One morning, John noticed subtle changes in the behavior of Shadow. The horse was restless, snorting at the wind and pawing at the ground. John knew that animals could sense things humans could not. He gathered the women and instructed them to remain calm while he investigated the ridge nearby. As they approached carefully, they saw a small group of travelers moving across the distant hills. They were not threatening, but John used the opportunity to teach the women how to observe and evaluate potential dangers without panic. The day passed with lessons, laughter, and shared effort. John realized that the women were no longer strangers in his life. They were partners, companions, and friends. He had spent so many years expecting loneliness, yet here they were, transforming his life in ways he had never anticipated. He saw that even in the harshest desert, kindness, courage, and trust could flourish. By the time the first flowers of spring began to bloom among the desert rocks, the cabin felt truly alive. The walls no longer echoed with emptiness. The fire no longer burned only for warmth. It burned for companionship, for shared stories, for laughter and learning. The women moved confidently through the space, carrying out tasks, offering advice, and caring for each other. John felt pride, relief, and a quiet joy that had been absent from his life for decades. And yet, in the back of his mind, he knew that life would never be entirely free of danger. But now he also knew that he did not have to face it alone. Together, he and the women had learned to survive, to trust, and to find strength in each other. The desert, once a place of solitude and quiet despair, had become a home filled with life, courage, and hope. John McAllister, the cowboy who had once believed he would die alone, now understood something profound. Life could challenge you, test your courage, and threaten your peace, but it could also bring unexpected joy, friendship, and the discovery of a family in the most unlikely of places. And in the quiet of the desert, surrounded by the women who had become his family, he felt something he had long thought impossible, a deep, unshakable sense of belonging. Spring had fully arrived in the desert, painting the land with soft greens, bright wildflowers, and the fresh scent of new life. The cabin of John McAllister had never felt more alive. Laughter echoed from within its wooden walls, the crackle of the fireplace mingled with the sounds of birds outside, and the gentle rustling of wind through the desert brush seemed almost musical. What had once been a quiet, lonely place was now a home in every sense of the word. John stood outside, leaning on the fence, watching the women tend to the small garden he had helped them plant near the cabin. Ahuli knelt carefully among the shoots of herbs, her hands working the soil with care, while Naeli watered the young flowers, humming softly. Kiona moved with grace, arranging stones along the edge of the garden to form a small path. Even the simplest tasks had become a shared effort, a way to nurture not just the plants, but their lives together. John felt warmth rise in his chest, a feeling that had once seemed impossible in the vast, empty desert. The previous winter and spring had tested them all in ways they could never have imagined. They had survived storms, learned new skills, and faced danger together. But each challenge had strengthened their bond. John watched as the women laughed over a small mishap with a watering can spilling over the edge, and he realized that the cabin had transformed not because of him alone, but because they had brought their spirit and courage into it. The desert no longer felt harsh and empty. It was alive with connection, trust, and hope. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the mesas, painting the sky with brilliant oranges and pinks, John called the women together around the fire. "You've all grown stronger than you know," he said, his voice steady but warm. "Not just in skill, but in heart. This cabin, this land, it is no longer just mine. It is ours. You've brought life here that I thought was lost forever." Ahuli looked at him with a soft smile, Nayeli's eyes sparkled in the firelight, and Kiona's cheeks glowed from the warmth of the flames. There was pride in their eyes, pride in what they had endured and accomplished together. The women had grown comfortable, but they had also grown thoughtful. Ahulai spoke first. "We came here frightened, not knowing if we would survive. But you taught us how to live in this land, how to face dangers with courage, and how to care for one another. We are stronger because of you, John." John felt a lump in his throat. He had spent years alone, believing his life would end in solitude. Hearing their words, he realized that his life had changed completely, not through magic or luck, but through care, trust, and shared effort. The days became routines of joy, work, and learning. They ventured farther into the desert, exploring hidden canyons, discovering small streams, and observing the animals that lived in the harsh environment. John taught them how to track rabbits and deer without harming the delicate balance of nature, how to recognize signs of storms in the clouds, and how to preserve food for the months ahead. The women taught him to read the land in ways he had never considered, noticing subtle patterns in the wind, the songs of birds, and the hidden trails that marked the passage of other creatures. Each day was a lesson, each day a gift. One afternoon, while exploring a nearby ridge, they discovered a wide, shallow cave. John suggested it could serve as a shelter in case of sudden storms or as a quiet place for reflection. The women eagerly helped clear the cave, stacking firewood and arranging it to make it welcoming. As they worked, John watched them and realized how much they had grown. Their fear had been replaced with confidence, their caution balanced by curiosity and courage. Together they had become a family, not by blood, but by shared experience, trust, and love. As the weeks passed, John noticed subtle changes in himself too. The solitude that had once been comforting now seemed hollow if the women were not nearby. He found himself anticipating their laughter, their questions, and even their gentle teasing. He realized that life's value was not measured by survival alone, but by the relationships that brought joy, understanding, and warmth. For decades, he had thought himself incapable of such connection, yet here it was stronger than any fire he had ever built. Evenings became moments of reflection and shared storytelling. They would sit around the fire, the flames dancing against the cabin walls, sharing memories from the past, stories of the desert and dreams of the future. John recounted tales from his days as a cowboy, riding across endless plains under starry skies, and the women shared their own stories of mountains, rivers, and the lives they had left behind. These evenings were more than entertainment. They were a way to understand each other, to honor their journeys, and to strengthen their bond. One particularly quiet evening, after a day spent exploring a distant canyon, John and the women sat outside, watching the stars appear one by one. The sky stretched endlessly above them, filled with twinkling points of light. Ahulai leaned her head on John's shoulder, Nayeli sat cross-legged beside the fire, and Kiona carefully traced constellations with her finger, whispering the stories her people had taught her. John felt an overwhelming sense of peace. He had come to the desert expecting solitude and survival, but instead, he had found family, companionship, and a reason to cherish life every single day. The years ahead promised their own challenges. The desert was unpredictable, storms could come without warning, and danger could always lurk beyond the horizon. But John no longer feared these things in the same way. He had learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but the ability to act despite it. He had learned that strength was multiplied when shared, and that love and care could flourish even in the harshest conditions. With the women by his side, he knew they could face whatever came together. As summer approached, the desert transformed again. Flowers bloomed brightly, streams ran full, and the heat of the sun brought new life to the land. John and the women tended the garden, repaired fences, and explored new areas farther from the cabin. They found joy in small things: a wild rabbit hiding in the brush, the flight of a hawk overhead, the beauty of a sunset across the mesas. Each moment was precious, a reminder that life was full of gifts waiting to be discovered, especially when shared with those who mattered. John reflected on how far they had come. The three women who had arrived at his cabin in fear and weakness had grown into capable, confident, and wise companions. They had learned the ways of the land, but more importantly, they had learned to trust him, and he had learned to trust them. Together, they had created a life that was not just about survival, but about joy, learning, and the quiet happiness of belonging. The cabin, once silent and empty, now echoed with laughter, conversation, and the soft rhythms of daily life. The desert, once harsh and forbidding, had become a home filled with warmth and connection. John understood now that life's greatest treasures were not gold, land, or possessions, but the people who walked beside you, the shared moments, and the bonds that endure through hardships and joy alike. One evening, as the sun set and painted the sky with shades of pink and gold, John stood outside with the women around him. Shadow grazed nearby, the chickens had settled into their coop, and the air was filled with the quiet music of the desert, the rustling of leaves, the distant cry of a hawk, and the whispering wind. John looked at Ahuli, Naeli, and Kiona, and realized that the fear, loneliness, and sorrow he had carried for decades had been replaced with hope, laughter, and love. John McAllister, the cowboy who had once believed he would die alone in the desert, now understood the true meaning of life. He had found family in the most unexpected place, courage in the faces of those he had protected, and happiness in the quiet moments shared with people he cared for deeply. The desert no longer symbolized isolation, but connection, survival but also joy, hardship but also beauty. He smiled, feeling the warmth of the fire on his face, the cool desert breeze on his back, and the presence of the three women who had transformed his life. For the first time in decades, John knew that he would not die alone. He had discovered that life, even in its harshest forms, could be full of hope, family, and love, if one was willing to open their heart to it. And in the quiet of the desert, with laughter, stories, and companionship surrounding him, John McAllister finally felt at home.